welcome you all to our webinar on resilience and mental health. And I'm very happy to say that we had a record number of signups for this one. And I think it really goes to show the importance of the topic and that people are taking it very seriously. For those who are joining us for the first time, I am Luísa Ferreira, Head of Social at the European Investment Bank Institute. The Institute is the philanthropic arm of the EIB, the EU Policy Bank. Today, we have with us four speakers, Anna Mortimer, Rim Hagona, Ajay Kanandval, and Christina Hammond. The four of them are therapists at the Mindfield World, who mainly support humanitarian and international development workers, journalists, and other first responders on site of humanitarian disasters, i.e., people who do some of the toughest jobs. And you may wonder, why are we having this webinar when in the social program we support social entrepreneurs? And the reason is, for us, social entrepreneurs also have some of the toughest jobs I know. They took on their hands changing the world to be a better place, and that is a joy, but it can also be a very lonely and difficult journey. I will let Anna introduce herself and her colleagues, but I wanted to very quickly to share with you her story by reciting what she wrote about herself on the Mindfield's website. I don't think there's a better way to tell it, and I will do it right now. I'm a former journalist, once Moscow correspondent for the Times. I grew up with a war correspondent father who was killed in El Salvador in 1989. I was 19 at the time and thought he was tough, glamorous, hard-beaten, and generally speaking, pretty cool. I only realized later that he was chronically anxious, alcohol dependent, and probably quite traumatized by the horrors he had experienced on the job. He was, as an obituary writer put it, penitentially lonely with a string of catastrophic relationships trailing in his wake. So this made Anna firmly believe that there are no prizes for toughing it out alone, for not getting help. That is what she learned from her father, and I hope that, and I'm looking forward to learning from her and her colleagues today. So without further ado, I now pass the mic to Anna and her colleagues. Anna, the mic is yours. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Louisa. Gosh, that was quite an introduction. I'm not I'm not sure if that was how I would have introduced myself, but thank you. It is really exciting to see so many people here today. And thank you all for your questions. Hopefully a lot of them will be answered during our conversation, and we will address a few separately at the end. So I'm Anna, as Louisa told you, co-founder of the Mindfield, and we offer video therapy mainly to journalists and aid workers in the field all over the world and in loads of languages. But we do, of course, offer therapy to lots of people out of that demographic. I'm here with Reem, RJ, and Christina, all Mindfield psychotherapists, to talk to you about resilience, as you already know. It's a word that comes up a lot in therapy. Is this person resilient? I think what we tend to mean is, can we access a part of them that sort of wants to survive and flourish even in extreme adversity? RJ, is that how you understand resilience?
Well, I thought I'd start off with a personal story because, uh, you know, it's easy to sit in my armchair and talk about resilience theoretically or from a textbook, but I broke my arm a couple of years ago when I was out cycling. So I thought I'd take up a safer sport. And then I broke my right arm playing tennis, imagining I was Roger Federer, and snapped my humerus. And I thought, well, a sensible person would perhaps think this is a good sign to sort of take it easy and retire from these dangerous sports. But I thought, I don't want to do that. Um, I want to be resilient. I want to keep going forwards. I want to bounce back. So I decided to run an ultra marathon, which is 31 miles with 4,000 feet of climbing. And I thought, I mean, that sounds stupid, right? But I thought that's what it is to be resilient. Um, and I got a coach for this endeavor, Sophie Grant, who's an ultra marathon coach, and she's done crazy things like the Marathon des Sables through the desert and the UTMB, which is a big alpine race which starts off in Switzerland,
Mm.
which goes on for hundreds of miles. And I spoke to her yesterday, and I said, you know, Sophie, what is resilience? What do you think resilience is? And I'm just going to read a bit out from what she said to me. She said, for me, resilience isn't about surviving that one big thing. It's about the daily effort to build your mental and physical strength. It absolutely is a muscle that can be developed, much like our fear receptors. Having small doses of hard things builds a bank of knowledge that you'll be okay. I like to think of my resilience bank as a filing cabinet. Every time I have a new experience or overcome a doubt that gets filed away for the next time. As runners, I think we actively seek out these experiences in our sport, but we all go through periods in our lives that build resilience. Often, when things are tough, the only way is through, and that may end in a positive or negative outcome. But regardless, the world keeps spinning and we move on. So, you know, some of us bend. In my case, I broke both arms. And this image of the filing cabinet, I very much liked. It sort of stuck in my mind. We all have a treasure trove of difficulties. Life is tragic. Things go wrong. Um, there's climate catastrophe, there's global warming, there's inequality, there are problems at work, there are problems for social entrepreneurs, there are difficulties in relationships. Life is tragic, but we survive and we keep moving forwards. And all of us have got a filing cabinet. And I wonder if the audience here today maybe could image or capture an image of their own personal bank of adversities and their own personal inner resources for overcoming difficulties. Because, of course, resilience is an inside job, it's an inner thing. You know, what have you got? Everyone's different, but what works for you? What works for you might not work for me. Um, And I'm going to finish, but just to say, with Sophie's guidance, I did get to the finish line without breaking any more bones.
Thank you, RJ. Well, that's good to hear. We'll definitely come back to some of those thoughts, I think, but it does feel important, though, to think about what resilience isn't, I think. We meet a lot of people, all of us do, all the time, who have suffered even really extreme trauma, but who say they're fine, that they can endure anything. But that kind of ability to endure often isn't really very sustainable. Reem, could you talk to us a bit about what resilience isn't, in your view?
Yeah, sure. And just to say, I think it's a really good point that you make, Anna, because I think oftentimes we often think that because you've overcome some sort of traumatic event, whether it's, something such as a death of a family member or escape to war, that you're somehow someone who's incredible or someone who's strong. And people often kind of compliment the person and say, I can't believe what you've done, and you're amazing. And it gives us the sense that you either are resilient or you're not, and then you need to just toughen things out. But the reality is that we just do what we can to survive the experience in that moment. And that can happen in different ways. We all know that we have different responses. to any sort of traumatic event, whether we fight, we flee, we freeze, we flop. And unfortunately, we don't get to choose how our body responds in that situation. And there's also something to think about in terms of going into survival mode. This belief that we have to tough out a situation or fighting is the only option. And then we start to think, well, well, I won't bother others with what my problem is. I don't want to burden my friends. I don't want to burden my families. I don't want people to think that I'm weak. And so resilience here is about acknowledging and opening up to your own vulnerability. And by doing that, you allow yourself to feel. We all have emotions. We have a variety of emotions that we can engage with. And when you allow yourself to feel, you allow yourself to fail then. You fail a situation, you learn from it, and then you grow. And of course, it's not a straight line. These things can, you can take 2 steps forwards, you can take 3 steps back, you can take another 5 steps forward. It carries on because that's just the journey that we're on. But it's really important, I think, to recognize that when you're struggling, that you can ask for help. And another thing just to say as well is that by our nature, we are emotional beings. We can't help but feel. So if you're denying your feelings, then you're also, being stuck and you're not allowing yourself to grow. We're social beings as well. As humans, we're social and we relate to others and we don't exist in a bubble on our own. So it's not about just going at things on your own. That, we have to, a lot of our inner strength comes from also seeking support from others, connecting with others around us. And finally, the what I wanted to mention is about how resilience is often defined as this ability to bounce back from adversity. There's this pressure to return to a previous state where before the trauma, where that can oftentimes, people can think about that state as being kind of the perfect place that I was in, that everything was going great at that time. But the reality is you've gone through something that was really difficult and might have actually changed you as a person, might have actually shifted your own perception of life and how you are and how you relate to the world around you. And there can be that pressure to move back to that state, but it's not possible. It's not always going to be possible. And so it's important to kind of acknowledge that actually that you went through a really difficult time. You did go through, something that was really impactful on you, and it's had a real impact on your life. But then to kind of think about, well, where am I now? How can I kind of use that experience, and how can I then relate it to thinking about how it then kind of relates to how you perceive and how you interact with the external world around you.
Yeah, thank you, Reem. I very much agree with all of that. And what you were saying about how people call it resilience when you just happen to have survived something because you did, really reminds me of a friend of mine who had a brain tumor, and she had an operation to have it removed while she was awake, and she had to keep speaking. And she kept saying that everyone told her she was so brave, but she didn't feel brave at all. She just had absolutely no choice. And there was nothing special about her. She did it because she didn't want to die. So I think you're right, Reem. I mean, it's interesting, I think, how diverse this all is, how failure of all kinds, kind of professional, marital, in parenting and so on, how it affects people. There's a famous positive psychology study on failure and how it can result in helplessness or continued optimism, showing how some people just sink under feelings of hopelessness and others seem to, as you were saying, Reem, bounce back. Christina, can you help us think about that disparity?
Yes, those concepts were well defined by American psychologist called Martin Seligman, who argued that you can foster both resilience and well-being. So one can hopefully do something about that. Was his take on things. Things are not determined, and one always has agency. If we understand the concept of resiliency as adaptive levels of functioning in the face of adversity, so we adapt to something that is very challenging to us, then learned helplessness is failure to adapt, to take on board new information, to learn from experience, and continue functioning. Optimism, on the other hand, is an internalized belief that it is possible to overcome adversity, and then acting on this belief, you do something about whatever the predicament is. So as AJ coach says, even if you don't believe what the outcome is going to be, whether it's going to be positive or negative, you just keep doing it. You don't give up. You just keep making steps and moving forward, because that's what worked before. So it becomes like a muscle. It's an embodied experience of doing things that carries you through a particular situation. Many of you asked us, where does this capacity for resilience come from? Well, in preparation for today, I was trawling through some scientific papers, and I found this longitudinal study of twins, and on resilience in twins. And I mean, it's unsurprisingly, it points out the obvious things, and that is environment matters, genes to some extent for certain things, but environment seem to be mattering more. And so the worse the environment is early on in life, the worse it has an impact. It has a worse impact on the capacity to be resilient. But what the paper also says, and I guess this is what Ajay is bringing up as well, is that small doses of exposure to stress over time, it builds that muscle. It helps us to deal with adversity later in life better. It is the way that one stores those goodies in a filing cabinet. So manageable exposure to stress is a way to fill your cabinet, and you have something in store for those unpredictable times when you may get surprised by some event that really knocks you down. And so, as I was saying, and also what Seligman was saying, is that you can foster well-being and resilience. And if the environment can be adverse, so it can be positive. So perhaps organizing one's environment to the best of one's ability to, so that it is a supportive one, with social connections, with encouraging relationships, with care and self-care is something that we all need.
I suppose, I mean, that makes it sound as if that's if we have agency, though, isn't it? And I suppose that it leaves me wondering what we do if we fall into the group that doesn't feel optimistic about ourselves in the first place, if we are people who catastrophize and sink into despair, which is obviously easily done, as we all probably know. Some of you may already know that the US Army, quite predictably, has a whole training program called Comprehensive Soldier Fitness that is designed to help individual soldiers become more resilient. I feel a bit cynical about this kind of thing, but that there are lots of tips there that are interesting and have reflections in psychotherapy, for example. And I think this is a bit filing cabinet-y. For example, looking at your deeply held beliefs, like asking for help is a sign of weakness, and then reality checking those beliefs. But a lot of the program seems impossible to achieve, like build community, focus on the positive, see failure as a fork in the road. Is it really possible, RJ, and I think you're going to say that it is, but is it really possible to become more positive just by trying? If, unlike soldiers, we are like living and working alone, it seems that loneliness is a huge barrier to overcome, quite apart from just maybe being miserable anyway.
For me, it's the American study is interesting because I'd say, well, it's a perfectly healthy response to break down if you're serving the US Army on a foreign posting. In fact, perhaps that's the most ethical thing to do, and breakdowns are important. You know, lots of jobs with lots of corporations you shouldn't go back to work. You should have a breakdown, maybe. You know, because our job as therapists, we are not in hock to the corporation or the state. We are together with the patient to think about their lives and truly, deeply, what do they want to do? How do they feel? We don't just want to get them back to work. We're not an extension of a human resources department that wants more productivity, more publications, more social enterprises. Sure, if you want to do that, fine, we can help you do that. But that's not really where we're coming from. So we don't love breakdowns, but it's a territory we're comfortable with. It's the shadow side of life that no one talks about when things go wrong, and things really do go wrong in lots of people's lives. So I'd say that breakdowns are good sometimes, and they're needed to think about things. I'd actually say that some of this is wishful thinking. It's really impossible. You can't do it on your own. I mean, it's just what a punishment, because if you then fail at being resilient, you're going to feel even more of a failure. You're going to feel even more humiliated and despondent that you can't succeed when this shiny manual tells you what you can do in terms of self-help. Sure, it might work for 1 in 100 people, but most of the time, in my experience, you need a friend or it doesn't have to be a therapist. You need someone you can talk to. It can be someone you meet for a cup of tea. You need someone, if you're a social entrepreneur, to share some of your troubles. And then you also may need a bigger group that you can go to and share your experiences. You do need a structure. Otherwise, it's just sort of wishful thinking. So I feel very pessimistic about the scenario of the person who's alone really helping themselves. I really don't think they can.
No, I'm glad you said that. I was worried you might say yes, do this, that, and the other. I obviously absolutely agree with you. And I also tend to think that not everyone is resilient, and nor should they be. We're not all the same. There might be somebody who is really vulnerable and does get really upset by all sorts of setbacks, and that may be a nice thing about them. It might make them kinder to others. It might make them, well, all kinds of different things. It's not a required quality for life necessarily, the kind of bounce back. It's
Most of us are losers. Most of us are
well,
failures. Most of us, things go. That's the truth of life, right? That's not
yeah,
the
right. Don't beat me down like this. No, I obviously agree with you. I was there's a famous experiment that was done in 1975 by a guy called Donald Hiroto that demonstrates learned helplessness. And he basically blasted 3 groups of people with unbearable noise, and there were variations in whether or not they could turn the noise off, basically. And he showed how quickly genuine helplessness and an inability to do anything about the noise drew people into resignation and passivity and a feeling that they can't change anything in their environment. And I was thinking that he could equally have looked at people living under authoritarian regimes, both politically, but also on a domestic level and in the workplace. And as our therapists all know, in international aid, we often see people who are in abusive relationships with their actual organization, and who experience a similar kind of despair and burnout as those in abusive personal relationships. It clearly, when we were all small children, none of us had any agency at all, really, over what happened to us. And some people do drag this feeling into adulthood with them. But then again, kind of as you were saying, RJ, we do all have our hopes and dreams shattered to at least to some degree as we emerge from childhood. And so it's almost the definition of becoming an adult, isn't it? So I was wondering, whether we should even try to be resilient, or whether this learned helplessness is something that can be worked on, or whether we maybe just have to accept it. Reem.
Um, Yeah, I was just thinking now as you were talking, IJ, and I was also thinking about a training I recently did. It was a compassion. It was a compassion-based mindfulness training I recently did, um, and I'm just going to speak about this very quickly. But there was an exercise in it that involved us pairing up. And so, for example, I would be someone who'd be facing away from my partner, and they would come and whisper um, a or a negative self-belief that I would have about myself. So, for example, that I'm going to mess this up, and they would come and whisper this into my ear, and I remember feeling really ashamed of myself. Just hearing those words said out loud, I remember feeling a real shame with myself about how could I think about this of myself? Because then what would happen is the person would then whisper something positive. So another outlook of how I can view the situation. And it doesn't have to be something extreme, but it could be something, well, maybe there's another way of doing this. Maybe I can figure this out. And that in itself gave me a sense of hope, um, that things don't have to always, there isn't just one way of doing things. But also, as I was saying, the whole training was around compassion and about being compassionate with yourself. And I realized that actually that's something that I really struggled with for a very long time, just being kind to myself and allowing myself to kind of to feel guilty and to recognize that it's okay to feel guilty, but that I don't have to be ashamed of it. It doesn't have to be something that's going to drag me down or something that's going to hold me back. That there is a different way, that there can be other outcomes of a situation. Um, but yeah, a lot of it was about acknowledging my fears and acknowledging my anxieties and my worries of a situation. But also, a lot of what I do in terms of like with working with some of my clients is to say to them, well, okay, this is what your worries are. This is what it is that you think is going to happen for as possible outcomes of a situation. But let's also think about what else could happen. So it gives a person another view that it doesn't always have to be just because A and B or 1 + 1 = 2, then that's just the situation. There could be other ways of things falling into place. Um, but yeah, just to kind of finish by saying that often we can be our worst critics, and when we are like that, we can block ourselves from receiving a lot of support and praise from others. But it's also really important that we can be kind to ourselves, and that we can also praise ourselves when we are doing well, but also when we are struggling. That doesn't mean like you're a failure. It just means you're going through a difficult time. But things could shift, things could change. There's no state in life that's just permanent. There's always little shifts that happen in our lives, and it's about recognizing those changes.
Mm. It's interesting what you were saying about kind of reality checking thinking, because I know we all often find with our patients that people really believe the stuff that they're saying, and they can be really convincing as well, can't they? They can just say, yeah, well, if I do that, then she's going to say that, or he's going to do this, and I sometimes find myself sitting there going, yeah, and then thinking, no, wait a minute, you don't know that at all.
Yeah.
And so that kind of reality checking is so important. And it was interesting what you said about that course sounds fascinating actually, but the thing about being ashamed of thinking about yourself that way is I'm often so shocked by the way people report their own thoughts about themselves. I find myself really frequently saying to patients, gosh, you're such a bully, aren't you? You're horrible to yourself. You wouldn't say that to anyone else, I'm sure. And it's such a, some of us do it so naturally that you don't even know that that's what you think about yourself until you're hauled up, as you were saying, RJ, by somebody else. It's the collaborative thinking is so important, because if you just sit there by yourself mulling it over, you get very stuck. I'm going to cite another American now, my third of the day, I think, but I'm interested in this idea of Albert Ellis, who has an ABCD model. So the model is that C, the emotional consequences, and this is basically what you were just saying, Reem, that the emotional consequences stem not directly from A, the adversity, but from B, our own beliefs about the adversity. And I think, you know, as we're saying, that there is something there about the importance of reality checking all the time, because everyone, and again, a bit filing cabinety, but everyone has, I usually talk about a star chart that people have in their head, where they give themselves gold stars for things like not crying at work or something, or working for 24 hours without stopping, and then red crosses for having too many breaks or sleeping in or something. If we don't actually examine and reality check and update our internal wall chart all the time, and most of us put it there in early childhood, so often it's completely absurd, but we've just never even looked at it. You know, we can be exhibiting all sorts of bizarre behavior without even knowing it, I think. Christina, one of these difficult questions again, but can changing the way we view ourselves and our successes and failures really be as simple as examining the existing thought processes?
Well, I love Americans. They have this indefatigable optimism about self-agency, how they can do things better themselves. If only one just applies, it is possible, but I think it is much more complex than it is suggested here. And what I would like to mention is how context really matters. It matters. The beliefs that we have, no matter what they are, they came from somewhere. And at some point, I think it's very important to emphasize this, they were useful to us. Otherwise, we wouldn't have them. They were in some way advantageous, and this is why we kept them. And this may sound paradoxical, but you know, if a child is criticized all the time and then believes themselves to be bad, how could that possibly be useful? Well, if one grows up with parents who beat and criticize all the time, to then believe that the badness is in you, then it gives you a sense that you can actually do something about it. But if you think that your parents are really bad, well, that there's nothing to do about this. You can't change them, you can't escape, you can't do anything. It's a position of despair and desolation. So then to believe that is somehow with you gives you a possibility of actually doing something and surviving. So having beliefs and whether they're useful or unuseful, I think the starting point would be to, well, how did I get them? What kind of function did they serve for me? I think that's important to keep in mind. And they are, of course, you know, the beliefs that we have depend, you know, they're very dynamic. They depend on what we do, how we live, who is around, what the environment is like. So I think somebody in their question asked, you know, how does one recognize that one is depressed? You know, is sleeping too long a sign of depression? Well, it could be, but it also could be, you know, on some days it could be a sign of depression. On other days you just need to sleep longer because you were tired and you were working very hard the previous week. So it depends really. So one needs to think about this. And as I was looking through the questions that were sent to us before the webinar, what came to mind, it was a lot of it was concerned how to manage stress, how to not to be overwhelmed, how to prevent being overwhelmed, etc. I came across this concept of weathering as defined by this an American academic called, her name is Arlene Geronimus. And she talks of weathering as a process that encompasses physiological effects on living in marginalized communities that bear the brunt of racial, ethnic, religious, class, and other ways of discrimination, which can be understood as pervasive, stressful environment over a long period of time. Now, weathering is kind of a process really of attrition of that filing cabinet that we were discussing a bit earlier. That it results from sustained, repeated, and sustained activation of physiological stress response over many years and even decades. counterintuitively, the effect of weathering are even more pronounced for those who exercise grit, resilience, and determination in the face of prejudice, because they keep trying to get up and do something. You get up and do, as social entrepreneurs, you have to face all sorts of barriers and resistances in the institution that you try to change, the people that you want to mobilize and get them do things differently, etc. So you constantly have to convince somebody to do something that they don't really want. And that's, frequent adversity then requires a high effort of psychosocial coping. So you have to really use all your goodies in your cabinet to keep doing your job. So here's a situation where relatively resilient people are being exposed to pervasive stresses that over time have an effect of attrition. And when one gets spent like this, then it's much more difficult to stay, I guess, to stay with oneself and remain resilient if suddenly, for example, you experience some kind of event in your life that really pushes you and stretches you. So I guess what I'm trying to say, going back to previous discussions between Anna and Ajay, is that there's not only the difference between people in how resilient they are, but there's a difference in yourself about how resilient you are at different times. You're not resilient forever. The resilience that you have is not always constant. It changes, it depends. You need to replenish yourself. So all this is very dynamic. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind. I would like to use two examples of why, how this matters to us collectively. For example, COVID, it requires us to adapt and really stretch our resiliences. We need to live with it. We need to face death of ourselves and others close by. We need to keep working, eating, paying bills, raising children in confined environments, working alone at home. And once it was all over, the lockdowns and all of it, we have to live with the aftermath of this. That's a continued stress now that was not previously there, that is now had been going on for 3 years. So that's a collective situation that affects us all more or less, but I think that's it's important to keep that in mind. There are also, of course, positive examples about how when the environment changes, how that affects people's well-being. So Arlene Geronimus then cites that in the year that after the gay marriage was legalized in Massachusetts, for example, the physical and mental health of gay men significantly improved compared to the year before. And hypertension fell by 18%, depression fell by 14%, and overall people felt better and they were less ill. So it matters the context in which we live. And that's, yes.
Yeah, I mean I absolutely agree, and it's that kind of learned helplessness from abusive relationships with anyone. It can be one person or a whole society or your organization or the other gender, or it's that kind of becoming demoralized over time obviously must be a massive factor. A lot of you asked how we recognize lack of resilience or signs of burnout or stress or depression in ourselves and others. And I thought it was such an interesting question, and it was quite a frequent one, because I feel as if we do fundamentally recognize when we're not well. You know if you're drinking too much or not sleeping or isolating or feeling paranoid or exhausted or demoralized. You kind of do. And I think that the same is true of others when we see others who are struggling. I think part of us definitely does know. It's like looking at children in a playground. If you see there's a group of children playing together and having fun, and then there's a more isolated one who looks a lot less happy and isn't joining in, we can see that someone's struggling, and it's probably because of stuff going on at home and whatever else. But I think a big part of us doesn't want to see it, doesn't want to know. And likes to dismiss it as, oh, they're just tired, or I'm just tired, I'm overthinking, I'm too sensitive, or they are, or, you know, maybe it's just not their day and tomorrow they'll be playing, or whatever it is, because we do struggle. I think we kind of stigmatize unconsciously almost that our own struggles and the struggling of others around us, because I think often people think, oh God, I did notice, or I knew I wasn't really very well, but so I think it's about trusting ourselves really, and taking ourselves seriously, and taking our thoughts about both ourselves and others seriously, and respecting those thoughts, and sort of being honest with ourselves. So, Reem, would you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah, very much. Just as you were talking, I was just thinking about how it's, you know, that there's a fear, I think, that um if you're in that position where someone is struggling and they need help, there's a fear that you're going to make it worse if you say something.
Mm.
So it's to keep quiet and not get involved. So you end up being, I guess, a bystander, in a way. But also think about not knowing what to say, and you know, not knowing if you're going to say the right thing or the wrong thing. I think oftentimes, like, it's you don't have to say something. There's something simply just about just being there present for the person, listening to them, um, and just physically just being there present, because oftentimes people sometimes are not in that place where they want someone to give them advice or someone to tell them what they should do or how they should feel or anything like that. They just want someone there so so they can feel less alone, I think. Um,
Mm.
yeah.
With resilience, there is this kind of also a sort of Nietzschean idea of what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. And I think a lot of people do take on difficulties or traumatic events or just ordinary failures kind of as badges of pride. For example, lots of people who suffer appalling loss use their experience to help others, kind of almost sort of use it to carry on and wear it. But I was wondering about just basic professional demoralization. I used to be a journalist and a novelist, and if I worked really hard by myself on a novel that my editor hated, or I once got sacked from the Sunday Times, and it was impossible not to take it personally and feel demoralized and rejected, because it was personal and I was rejected. RJ, how would you have helped me?
Well, Anna, I would commiserate with you because they're stupid, aren't they? How could they have?
Yeah.
You're brilliant. You're absolutely amazing. I'm not one of those analysts that would just go, hmm. I would commiserate with you, and I would get you a glass of water, and I might even let you call them names and join in with you, because really. But I guess once we'd done that expulsion of feeling, I would be on your side. I might try and help you regroup, refuel, and find your inner author. You know, what's the story? You know, not what your editor wants you to write. What do you want to write? What's the script inside you? I know you're a creative person, so I think in your case, I would think, well, there's more here. There's another act. And I don't need to know what the act is going to be. We don't need to rush into that right now. But I'd provide a space for that to be thought about. I had another thought was, you know, thinking of our social entrepreneurs, you know, us therapists often we work in great isolation and alone. And one of the things we're talking about, a community or a group, is something that's unfolding here today, because I'm getting a chance to hear from my fantastic colleagues about their thinking and their ideas. And the four of us are meeting. And there's something wonderful about that experience in time. I had a dream whilst preparing this presentation about honeybees, and I had these honeybees on my neck, and I wasn't sure if they were going to sting me or they were going to sort of give me some nectar. And I was a bit squeamish, and I kind of kept moving around. And I wondered about our audience, because I thought, well, maybe they spend their time buzzing around trying to come up with new ideas. And they try and create nectar, something sweet for civilization from their labors. But it's precarious. You can get stung. I don't know if that's a bit fanciful, but as therapists, we like to just sometimes notice things, weird things that go on in our minds and our patients' minds, and try and explore them.
I think you're the flower, RJ, and your patients are the bees coming to get the nectar of your wisdom. That's my interpretation for that.
But if I upset them, then they might sting me
Right.
and die. So it's quite a responsibility, right? Well, thank you. I like the flower interpretation, Anna. This is great. You come to me for help with your because you've been sacked
Yeah.
and you're helping me, which is
And I did have an analyst who went, at the time, unfortunately. But we are talking here really about professional resilience, aren't we? And especially for people who are working very hard on passion projects of their own, and things that matter enormously to them, to you. I can't actually see any of you, but to you, and on which you're working a lot of isolation. Reem, are there kind of, everybody wanted a quick fix, and I know it doesn't exist, but are there ways of keeping our heads above water in these really difficult circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, I say yes because, you know, of course there is. There's always that hope. Yeah. But I think oftentimes that we already have a lot of those tools within us, of what, you know, things that we can do to kind of to manage our well-being, to kind of keep ourselves sane, to keep ourselves going and functioning, you know, outside of our professional lives and our personal lives. I think for me, the first thing I always think about is a sense of a belonging, a sense of connection with others. You know, as we've all said throughout this webinar, is that we can't exist on our own. We don't. And you know, there's something I think really important about the idea that, you know, we are a part of something that's bigger than us. That, you know, we can be a part of a community, we can be part of a group of friends, we can be a part of, you know, a city or a community or country, but that there are others around us. And I think once we recognize that, we start to kind of think, well, we start to kind of you know, we can access others around us and realize that others might also be experiencing similar situations, that we're not there on our own, just kind of going through our own shit, I guess, for lack of a better word, that there are others who are also experiencing similar shit situations. And I think it's so that's, I guess that's one thing I think about. But there's also something about, I think, stepping out of our comfort zones, challenging ourselves. I'm sure, you know, that we all do that in certain ways, and whether it's in our professional careers or in our personal lives, but that is always going to keep us kind of, you know, on our feet, but keep us being curious and being interested in different situations and different experiences, and being interested and curious in our surroundings. And that, you know, also allows us to kind of to grow and to kind of reach out and engage more and participate, I guess, in different areas.
I
Yeah.
mean, I suppose that's obviously right. But as you were speaking, I just always think about people who can't, who don't. You know, when you said we don't exist alone, some people really do almost. I mean, it can be so hard if you are really isolated. I mean, I don't know that any of the people listening to us today are that isolated, but it is possible. And I'm just thinking, what if we don't have any friends or a supportive partner? What if we're constantly knocked back and are too shy to join these communities? And I was going to sort of come back to myself and say that I always found breakups completely catastrophic. You know, these relationships aren't always good, and they would take me years to get over. And I you know, I trawled through the reasons for this in my own analysis, but I was wondering, Christina, what do you think relationships do? Because they can build our resilience, but they can also batter it, surely, right?
Yes, they can. And I was, when I was going through the questions posed to us, and, people were saying, well, how do I feel less overwhelmed? What do I do with a colleague who is too demanding? How do I stop my boss, writing to me at 11 o'clock in the evening when I, with more work? And I'm just thinking, well, why don't you just say no? I mean, that's of course easier said than done. But I guess the next question is, what makes it so difficult to say no? What's the difficulty there? And that perhaps with relationships, there could be those who are good for us and those who are that are bad for us. But I would imagine, from my own experience and the experience of people that I work with, is boundaries are very important, and that is a crucial ingredient of a healthy relationship. And in my work, a lot of the time I spend talking to people about boundaries. Why is it that they, for example, can't say no? What did they imagine that would happen if they would say no and don't answer that email at midnight? Well, probably nothing would happen, but they think that something would happen. And maybe that's something to keep in mind and to think about that. Why is it difficult to say no? What makes it so difficult? Another thing that I wanted to say, of course, perhaps the most important relationship is the relationship that we have with ourselves. And as Reen was explaining and telling us about her training on mindfulness and compassion, there's an internal voice that can be supportive or undermining. How do we treat ourselves when nobody's watching, for example? What do we say to ourselves? How does that all work? And I think that's very important to be thinking about as well.
So a lot of the questions, and we've sort of addressed the idea of the quick fixes being fairly unrealistic, I suppose, already, but a lot of the questions were about kind of, what do I do? How do I get to sleep if I'm having negative thoughts? How can I bear mind-numbing work? And again, as you say, Christina, I sort of say don't, if it's possible. But I think, of course, there aren't really, people want sort of tricks and tips, and it just doesn't, I think, work like that. Unfortunately, it'd be lovely if it did. We'd all be fine all the time, wouldn't we? But I think somebody else said, is there any point in having a one-off therapy session? And I actually was thinking, that's the one quick fix that might actually have some value. And I think it's always useful to chat things through with a therapist, whatever the issue is, really. And I think one session can definitely be helpful. I mean, as we all know, that first session, especially the Mindfield issues a questionnaire before the first session to sort of help make the most of it. But I think, as we all know, that first session is so important, isn't it? And lots of things come out, and it can be very emotional. And not to say that it wouldn't be better to have some more, but it can, even as a standalone, I think, be quite useful. We as psychotherapists wrap up at a sort of 50-minute time, and I'm noticing that it's 54 minutes. But I was just wondering if any of you have some final thoughts before we end. RJ's looking like you're champing at the bit.
I've got 2 lines that resonated with me as we prepared. From Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And then on my ultra marathon, towards the end, when I was just an old man flailing in the mud, I thought of this poem by Anthony Machado, and this speaks to some of the questions that we've been asked, which is, traveler, there is no path. The path is made by walking. Traveler, the path is your tracks and nothing more. Traveler, there is no path. The path is made by walking. By walking, you make a path, and turning, you look back. At a way you will never tread again. It goes on, but I guess I'll stop there.
Well, it's absolutely beautiful. But it made me cry. Well, thank you so much, guys. I think we are going to end there. Louisa was going to, yes, look, she's re-emerged from the blue.
I just wanted to say thank you, Anna, thank you, Reem, Jay, and Christina. To our guests, I hope that they had at least some of their answers, some of their questions answered. And the topic of mental health and resilience, it's a very important one for us. And I guess that we will have some other webinars on the topic. So just stay tuned for the next webinar. Thank you so much, and have a nice day or have a nice evening wherever you are.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.